lovely to see everyone here, and thank you for having me at the festival. And I'm very much looking forward to sharing with you some of my research that I've done on visual music over the years. As Noelle said, I've been very involved in this area for quite some time. I came across it quite accidentally, but you'll find out about that as I move through my paper here. So the title of my presentation is Colouring the Tones, the Emergence of a Visual Music Art. And I suppose I'm playing around with that idea of musical tone being linked to colour and how that might have evolved historically, and how it has some influence still today in practice and how people might create colours and tone and how they might go about that. But visual music is basically a kind of a practice in contemporary art, more so than maybe historical. The historical field emerged kind of slightly differently, and it's definitely greatly facilitated by music, moving image technologies that you have all been using, film, animation processes, electronic video, TV technology, digital video, computer coding. But it's also a practice that has many entry points, which is really fascinating. You have people coming to visual music from science backgrounds, computer science, architecture, music, visual art, and all kinds of different approaches. And each person brings that kind of aesthetic, that knowledge and skill into the arena. But it also has, I think, a characteristic of being a solo activity, more like a poet or a visual artist, or maybe even a composer. So it's a little bit different to maybe a studio approach where you might have a whole team of people working on the creative idea. It's often very individual or duo-led, but that's just giving you an idea of some of the characteristics today. But what's really helped it is the fact that we have a soundtrack that we can play back and listen to continuously to get a sense of the music. So we're not stuck with just maybe looking at the score and looking at music abstractly. We can listen to it, and we're very fortunate that we can play it back. So that kind of technology and non-linear editing, I think, has really facilitated the explosion of kind of audiovisual and abstract visual music that happens now. Even though I'm talking about contemporary at the moment, I would suggest if you really want to see contemporary work, the Punta Raya has an incredible archive, even their website, of contemporary practice. They have their biannual festival presents the most recent work with their call for works and their curations, and it's becoming an incredible resource of contemporary work, and it's a really go-to place to find out what's happening in this area, this fascinating area. I'm actually going to be looking at the history. I'm going to go back a little bit and maybe end there then at the contemporary. And I will show one or two examples from my own work, but I'm mainly focusing on the history. I'm not really focusing on my methods and stuff, it's just more the history. So, okay, without further ado, I'm going to look at this idea of analogy, the origins of, say, this idea of bringing music and some aspect of the visual domain together. In some ways, that idea of natural science, using analogical thinking, comparing things with using analogy, was a form of creating knowledge, as it were, through natural sciences. Another area then is maybe the idea of a metaphor. The fact that you might relate things through metaphor, that's also part of the history of this art. And of course, the evolution of abstraction, a subject matter for visual art. It's sometimes very hard to distinguish this area because it has all these factors. The idea that you connect things physically through some kind of medium or media provides new forms of expression, and of course that's the same with any technology. Even VR and AR begin to be used with, for say, audiovisual sort of expression, and the way you might adapt existing mediums or maybe invent them. And then I think an important part of it is the idea of composition. You're composing the images, maybe like a music composer, and maybe like a sound artist, how they might approach it. So that's just the overview of how I've actually divided up this area. So something like analogy then, that goes back to, of course, ancient Greek times, the idea that nature had a kind of a universal harmony principle, and that the mind can work out what that principle is. So we can work out those patterns. And the best way to do that was through mathematics, and maybe because they wanted the idea of certainty, that we have certain principles that really are ordering principles. So this idea of number, ratio, and geometry evolved as a kind of way of describing nature. And therefore what we see in here, rather than relying on our senses that can be very subjective, there's this idea of trying to find the principle behind the thing. So this is just a way of generating knowledge. But what's most interesting is the idea you can compare quantities in, say, analogy across domains. So, for example, the quantity of weight, maybe, the quantity of a length of a string, the weight of a hammer. Comparison between two quantities can give you a kind of a ratio. So this mathematical idea of analogy was the basis of how mathematics started to be used to quantify and to deal with the quantities that was apparent in music. So Pythagoras, in some ways, the idea that he found the mathematics, as it were, through geometric ratios, through his experiments, to find that, in fact, the most pleasing sounds, the octave, the fourth, and the fifth, could be represented with the most simplest ratios. And it was that idea of reducing things to the simplest form. So the octave and the fourth and the fifth, they had a kind of ratio relationship. So the story goes that hammer weights were compared mathematically and expressed in these ratios. So the octave was a 2-to-1 ratio. The fourth was 4-to-3 and a 3-to-2 for a fifth. So just, of course, I know all of you would know these intervals, I'm sure, but I'm just going to play them here. The octave, the fourth, and the fifth, as it were, and the tonic note. So it's this idea of harmony, having this kind of relative system between the whole and the parts. And again, the fact that it could be seen in music meant it possibly could be applied in other forms. So therefore, analogy then was used to compare with other phenomena. So these are some charts where this idea of the harmony ratios were also used to describe other phenomena that had order in it. So, for example, the idea you could order colour, even just the idea of the seasons and a good person. All these things could be done proportionally with a kind of a harmonic system and represented geometrically. So that was just a very interesting idea. And just the idea that through bringing these systematic approaches to kind of quantifying the weight of things, you create a balanced system. And of course, once it started to work with colour, that therefore opened up kind of the imagination, the way maybe colour and tone might be related. But just, I'm going to actually now divert away from that and show you an example of a work that I did myself. It was one of the earliest works I did in this field, where I was trying to work with audiovisual composition, I called it at the time. And my supervisor would say, find some connection between the audio and the visual, some kind of scientific process. He was an engineer and he was looking for certainty. And I was also looking for certainty. And I thought, okay, there has to be an ordering principle. I didn't know about this history. There has to be a simple ordering principle that connects both the audio and the visual. So I said to myself, what is that? And of course, that was taken on a very huge task. And I did not answer the question in the end. But I did my best to try and answer it. So what I did was I looked at the concept of harmony, and I did create a kind of a work based on harmony called Towards One. It was quite a symbolic work. When I look back now, it was really symbolic. It was a conceptual approach to harmony. So I took the tetracyte, which was the harmonic structure of these simple ratios, the octave, the fourth, and the fifth. I used that to generate synthetic sound. I used the Pythagorean scale using the cent system that he used. I also just used octave, fourths, and fifths. So it was really maybe a structuring principle that I used it for. So I'm just going to play this small section, and it's called the tetracyte section, where I was attempting to answer the question, what is this unity, and is it a mathematical unity that explains the unity? The idea that I was trying to create a form, a harmonic form, and also play around with the idea. I did come to the conclusion that it actually didn't explain what was driving me to do this audiovisual work, and nor did it explain the experience of the work. Because in the end, what I became more interested was the motion, the idea that there was motion in those figurative elements, and that there was an emotional quality once I started bringing in motion. So I felt this was much more interesting to me, but I couldn't articulate it as a language. And when I was trying to justify it to my supervisor, he was saying, where's the principle? But I did come to the conclusion that it was an assumption I had that there was an ordering principle, that it may not necessarily be the case. But it is the case that actually, sometimes if that's your structuring principle, for people who are very mathematically inclined, that is a fantastic way to go about constructing these worlds because it allows you to, to work with things that you're interested in. So that was my first composition, and but just to also show a historical work with John Whitney, this idea of geometry being applied then to maybe a motion path. So he would have used a Lissajous figure, and he played around with the progress of 24 squares around a motion path, using a mathematical figure, as it were, to drive this kind of animation. So this idea of maths and harmony does underpin some work. And this is an example of the matrix, and just you can see the Lissajous figure animated here, and then the squares were unfolding in that shape. So it's an invisible harmony. You don't see it, but it's felt, and it's also there because it's part of his plan. But it was to generate a kind of emotion and also a harmony in time. So that was just a diversion from the historical approach. Going back then to the colour-tone analogy, this idea that harmony, geometry, the mathematical proofs and reasoning could actually be applied to other phenomena. So for example, something like colour. And you have the idea, the quantity in colour of light and dark was the first aspect of this consideration. And even Aristotle also worked according to this principle of ratios and harmonic proportions to try and work out the most pleasing colours. And for example, just quoting Niall Hutchinson from his Colour Music in the New Age, if black were the keynote with white an octave above it, purple presumably contained 4 parts light to 3 of dark, and the ratio in red would be 3 to 2 of light to dark. So this idea of ratios and balance and proportion. If you're trying to work with paint, in order for it to be reproduced correctly, you have to have the right kind of proportions, rather than maybe just going according to your eye or something like that. And of course, it was Newton then that also then worked with another quantity, the wavelength, and he also used a colour tone analogy to explain what he discovered in his some of his experiments, not all of them. And I did kind of manage to get the 3 or 4 experiments that he worked with here, and he changed them each time he did a different version of this. The experiment slightly changed because he ended up getting into a row with another scientist called Robert Hooke, who kept saying you haven't used a colour tone analogy. So he wanted to use a colour tone analogy to kind of prove his point that there was a proportionate ratio of colour that was very similar to the proportions that were in a musical scale. And he mapped these out then as a kind of a colour that took up the same amount of room as these intervals in the musical scales, this idea of a step-by-step approach with different kind of weights. And again, I'm bringing it back to analogy, that quantity of wavelength is what's working at this point. And again, this triggered the imagination, I think, of other scientists, but it also triggered imagination of inventors. So I've just kind of a selection of here from in the early period of all these individuals. Some of them were scientists, some of them were colour theorists, some of them were just inventors, and that we're really interested in this idea of a colour tone analogy and exploring this idea of how can we now devise a sort of an instrument that could display this colour tone analogy. And initially, what it started out of was a scientific experiment. So people were devising instruments not because they wanted to play them, but because they wanted to prove the science. So Castel, the first, one of the earliest colour organ builders is Louis Bertrand Castel, and he invented a colour harpsichord called clavecin oculaire. And he was also very, very interested in the idea of this colour tone analogy, but he got quite annoyed with Newton's colour tone analogy because he said it doesn't work in all circumstances. So the science was a very particular experiment. And what he did, he had a slightly different system for mapping the colours and the tones, and he proposed a slightly different approach. And unfortunately, that's actually a caricature, because at the time, it wasn't necessarily very well received, so it was kind of laughed at that he was kind of doing this kind of practice. But at the same time, there is no other images of that time, but it does kind of show you that, this idea of the harpsichord. And he makes a very interesting observation that when you're sitting at a harpsichord concert, he says, it's embarrassing, you don't know what to do with your eyes. So he thought we need to have some visual, and he imagined that you could have animated visuals, which was most in that kind of romantic style. He wrote a passage about these cherubs and things going around the harpsichord. But he started to notice that there was an art to this, that this could actually be an artistic practice, but what he was trying to do was the science. But he does mention that this could be an art. And therefore, I'm only going to look at 2 or 3 here. continued to do this, and they actually built instruments, and each devised their own colour tone analogy. It started now moving beyond, okay, let's prove that this is a science, let's just work with our own. You might find that today in technology when you're maybe using a generative system or devising your own system to generate audio from visuals or things like that. You have your own systematic approach. This was kind of a systematic approach. So it wasn't a strict colour tone analogy, it was linked to his opinion, and he was more interested in the score. And the score, he felt, revealed certain things that didn't need to be changed. You just need to just use this music notation system and map the colours to the tones and to the score and make it a little bit easier. But he was most interesting in the fact that he noticed that if you have lighter colours, they should be in the high octave range, and deeper colours should be in the low octave range. So he's making a comparison between, say, pitch and shade and things like that. And then we have D.D. Jameson, another inventor and also a musician. He also devised a kind of a systematic kind of mapping, you could say, of quantities. And in his correspondence, he mapped colour hue to note, length of the colour to the duration of the note, the height of the colour to the octave the note belonged to. And again, he analysed the score, and he has a document, and that is available, called A New Art Form of Colour Music. So it's interesting, as this evolved, people started saying, this is an art. This is like a new art form. And it's amazing the amount of people who do that, and I do it myself. I'm kind of moving on a little bit here, but the arts also, in their interrelationship, started to explore metaphor, and it's a slightly different shift, and that's why sometimes, like any kind of art and its history, this is more to do with painting and how painting might relate to music, or the idea of the language of expression, borrowing concepts from one domain to another, exploring the science of colour, and the content of art moving beyond the object, that whole development that happened in painting. So the condition of music now became of interest to a theorist called Guillaume Apollinaire, and he was very interested in the new art of pure painting. And he felt, because it's not imitative anymore, and it's not necessarily dealing with, the reality as you would see it, he felt it was very similar to the purity of music, and that this was a kind of a new type of image, a new painting, and that these paintings had an aesthetic feeling that was different. And that's probably a characteristic of visual music. It's like a feeling that you might get when you listen to music. It's not really story-based, but it's based on a kind of this more aesthetic emotion, you could call it, for want of a better word. But he was very influenced by this, and he felt that there was a sort of that this was going to develop as an art in the future. So there's quite a fair bit of prediction, but he was particularly influenced by this artist, Leopold Sauvage, who was actually a Russian-French painter of Finnish origin. And while he was in Paris, he discussed the idea of creating a film with Apollinaire. Apollinaire tried to get him the funding, but he couldn't get the funding to make the film. So what he did instead, he did his hand-painted colour plates, and he saw the potential. He was also kind of involved in that abstract geometric art that was happening at the time, and he really saw the potential of what he called coloured rhythm. And what colour rhythm needed was the cinematographic. He needed cinema, it needed a film, and he had lots of plans for this, and there's several authors that wrote about Sauvage's work. He was so interested in the idea now of time being linked to colour, the idea that colour could be mobile, it's no longer a static thing, and you can have alternating series of colour. So he was very interested in colour, and interestingly, Bruce Shevsky, in 2005, brought together some of these screens, obviously probably without permission, to give you an idea of this coloured rhythm, because he takes them in sequence of how Sauvage creates them. And this is just like just a little example of what perhaps Sauvage might have been hoping to achieve if he managed to make the film. So it's very nice to do a homage to what Sauvage would have liked, to be honest. I would have loved if he could have made this film. But anyway, here we go. So abstraction then, of course, that's a very important part of contemporary visual music. Now, it doesn't always happen to be that the content is abstract. Sometimes it can be concrete. You're using real things, but you're using them for not for their reality reference. You're using them as just an element. It's part of your composition. So the new content of painting, particularly in Western painting, I suppose we're talking about, the subject matter is the things themselves of the painting, new visionary worlds, and the artist's subjectivity. And what's most fascinating is the musical influences, the idea that the language and structure of music and the condition of music, the experience of music, were of interest. And probably most of you will be aware of the abstract painting tradition, particularly Paul Klee and Kandinsky. So Klee was very interested in the structure of music, polyphony, fugue, rhythm, particularly the structure of music as up to the 18th century, he felt that's where music kind of started to move into the picture domain, and he felt that this was something that you could work with say, with painting. And he felt that what was the language of painting, he felt just wasn't able to describe what it was he was trying to do. He needed to structure it in a different way. So he found the structures in music to help him to find that idea that there's a structuring, maybe a bit like what I was trying to do myself, an outside ordering principle that can help you when you're doing this work. So therefore, he looked at the organization principle coming from those structures in music, like polyphony, which is many voices, many instruments, a fugue, the kind of way the fugue structure works, rhythm, counterpoint, call and response, and many voices. And this is just a small painting here of his work. And it's called Polyphony, and I've just got a small clip of a kind of Bach. It was Bach and Mozart's music particularly that influenced him, and it's just Prelude and Fugue number 2 in C minor. Lovely. Okay, so I've just ended that abruptly. Now, of course, it was an influencing principle. It wasn't necessary that he was putting the two together phenomenally, where you listen to it and play and do your painting, which is probably how visual music has emerged, a more phenomenal thing. And of course, the opposite scale then was Kandinsky, and he was more interested in dissonance. And interestingly, what he was moving towards abstraction anyway, atonality. The idea that in music, particularly Schoenberg's idea, that you no longer had to put those tones into a scale. Like, so what I've been showing you so far, but the scale being a structure step by step, and kind of the rules of harmony and the rules of the structuring. He was very fascinated with this atonality, that in fact the musician or the composer chooses the arrangement of the tones. It's no longer linked to a scale. And the painter, therefore, can choose their own forms and colours, and therefore there's a freedom. This is the painting. He actually called this Impression 3 from listening to a Schoenberg concert, and it really excited him to really move into this area of the idea of dissonance in music and the independence of colour. Moving on then to the two artists who really did start to really investigate the rhythm of the visual form language, as it were, which is Viking Edgling and Hans Richter. And they initially were probably involved in that art movement. Distilled, they were involved in that magazine Distilled, the Zurich Dada Group, Constructivism, and various journals that they did illustrations for. But they were very much also interested in rhythm in the scroll painting, and they felt that there was a sort of a counterpoint, a musical aspect to this, that there was a sort of an orchestration, as it were. And in fact, they had a theory of a kind of universal form language they were interested in exploring, to explore these effects. They were interested in this idea of the equivalence of the opposites, and it's something like composition. You're not trying to just, do one form. You're very aware of contrast, and you're also aware of affinity, where things are matching and things were a bit of a difference. So it's like a music composer. You don't just keep one note or one process. You're aware of just building up these kind of contrasts through different stages, and so it's kind of bringing you on a dynamic arrangement of these things over time. And they called this felt as being the music of the orchestrated form. They felt it was quite musical. There was something about this that was really interesting. Hans Richter was described as the orchestration of a theme developed in 11 drawings, and there's oppositions among the visual elements where a vertical line is accented by a horizontal, a strong line is connected with a weak one, a single line gains importance from many lines. So they're very conscious of the relationships between all these parts and elements, and they created a kind of sensation. They also felt it created a kind of a movement, that they were, it wasn't just rhythm anymore, but there was something moving about this. But I'll be coming back to them now in a minute, because I'm going to transgress now to how you might connect these things together. So in the early 20th century, this idea of connecting, often artists had to build their own devices. It was no kind of standardized processes. So, for example, Thomas Wilford, A very exciting character. Again, very multidimensional, which is often the case with this kind of field, that people can build the instruments, create the visuals and write about it, etc. He was interested in the idea of light being like a visual music, but it was a silent visual music. He didn't necessarily feel that you needed music with it, that the light in itself has an expressive quality that was able to be quite musical. And the reason why he called them, kind of referred to them as being more musical, he was very aware of the plastic arts and the idea of the plasticity of like sculpture and architecture, but he was very aware of time and space and the whole spatial dimension. But he had very many inventions. He invented many of these claviluxes, and this is one of his early ones here. And he invented some for large-scale performances, for smaller, even in your living room. And it kind of nearly looks like some of those early games that you would have seen, just for children to play, or adults, of course. So, in fact, what's interesting is he saw that maybe people would have these in their house, and they would be very popular, and have played their Lumiere compositions, as it were, in a dark space. This is Opus 161. These softly evolving forms. What's interesting about Thomas is that he did write about this, so he has some writings where he has his patents for the inventions, and they have been recreated for several exhibitions as well. Contemporary artist George Stagnick, who was very involved with kind of helping preserve Thomas Wolfer's work, but he also creates Lumiere compositions, and he sees them being this form of kind of silent visual music. He does often also use them as kind of projected scenery and performances. But again, he builds his own devices, he builds his own setting, and the whole idea of manipulating art with kind of optics and that kind of aesthetic and approach, which is can be very beautiful. Another inventor, and also an inventor who invented a score, a system of doing her light art, was Mary Hallock Greenwald. She also felt that this you could perform this light colour. She was very much interested in very detailed instructions. So again, it's a very systematic approach. She would have had her colours that she would have taken. She would actually created paintings, and from the paintings she devised kind of colour tones that she would have used. And it was very planned to go along with specific pieces of music, very well analysed and very well scored. So an incredible amount of work to develop her scale and to develop her system. And she also considered this being new art, and she called it Naratha. I'm probably not pronouncing that correctly, but she considered an art of light, fine art of light colour playing. So connecting then, of course, when we move back then towards maybe another way of connecting, which you're all really familiar with, which would be the moving image mediums like frame-by-frame animation, film, video, and computer graphics. I'm going to look at some of the early films, and then Puntaraya's curation this evening will take off from where I might leave off here. So the film medium provided another means of creating imagery, but except as in the initial early stages, like in the history of film, they would have been silent. So there was an idea that, so therefore they're exploring the formal language, probably without the music, but definitely sometimes music could be played, and there is probably a kind of a trend to actually play these old films and have someone play a music accompaniment. So you could say it's like an absolute film, a pure non-objective film, non-representational film, and I'm calling it a non-story because there is a kind of a narrative sometimes in these works, but it might not be based on script writing. The music expression is part of the artist's reason maybe to create the visual music, and its theories and forms and the things themselves, the image. Things I've already mentioned, they've all come into this idea of working with film. So it's like film and the moving image mediums brought together all those kind of developments, facilitating an expression that would be moving towards abstract animation and also maybe visual music animation as well. So this is just a short excerpt from Hans Richter. This is the scroll painting I mentioned where they felt the movement now needed the film to be able to bring the temporal element. So this is his called Rhythm 23. It might look very simple to our taste because we're so used to seeing images done in a way. But the idea, they were still exploring their language, their universal form language. They were really trying to articulate it. And obviously, working with frame-by-frame animation would have been quite new for them, so getting timings and pacings and everything. But the idea that they could play around with the image in this way, orchestrate their forms, not only now in the space of the painting, but over time to create a kind of a more of a visual music.
Viking edging, which I consider be one of my favourites because I feel a very elegant approach to the structuring of the image as it moves over time again. So these are parameters of rhythm, dynamics, and he called them instruments. He's considered them to be like, musical instruments with a sort of a rhythmic orchestration and aliveness to them. Of course, Len Lye, I'm sure most of you are very familiar with. The motion was very important, the art of motion. So the idea that the motion could be felt as well, not only just analysing it and being systematic, the feeling of motion. This kinetic art, he's another kind of poly artist that worked with various structures from painting, animation, kinetic sculpture, direct film techniques, and was interested in synchronizing images. But one of his features of a visual music work is this composing of motion, and Len Lye was an expert in this in terms of intuitively. And motion is movement, motion is a driving force, like I mentioned with John Whitney, but also motion itself creates the form. So when you compose a motion, you might not know what you're going to create, but sometimes motions emerge, and you can kind of work with those. There's also Norman McLaren that I know you'll be familiar with as well. Very similar style and approach. He's worked in the same GPO film unit as in his early career as Len Lye did. And again, incredible work that Norman McLaren, he needs a kind of a whole thing on his own work on itself. He actually synthetically created the sounds on the optical part of the film track, as well as on the normal part of the film track, to create a kind of very synthesized approach in film synthesis of sound. That film was incredibly intricately made. The music was measured note by note, phrase by phrase. Measurements were transferred to the dope sheet, charged onto the music on paper. Measures were numbered and put onto the film. So it was an incredible analysis of the music in order to bring forth the life of the music, you could say. Another maybe not very well known filmmaker is Mary Ellen Butte. She was very interested, again, various technologies, like as new technologies emerge. She worked with the oscillograph in one of her films, and she would have recorded it and then superimposed it on top of, say, normal traditional animation techniques, and maybe recordings as well, because she used multiple techniques. And what's interesting is the piece of music she used has a very Celtic feel to it. In this particular, two versions of this film called Abstronic, and again, it's the idea of the seeing. She was very much into seeing sound, but her work was not strictly about seeing sound. It was definitely aesthetically and artistically led. I'm nearly at the end now. I've just one or two more to show you. Of course, I can't really talk about the history of visual music without talking about John Whitney. Again, a filmmaker, inventor, film to computer graphics across a range of mediums. And he was very interested in the idea of digital harmony. I suppose that's why I wanted to mention him, because he was into this harmony principle. And he used the phrase visual music a lot in his writings. He was interested in the periodic relationships, maybe the interference and the counterpoint, maybe in audiovisual systems, and trying to get that real-time sense of a pattern emerging. So that was quite a challenge to do, but he had computer programs helping him to create these kind of graphics that were designed according to kind of a structuring, what he called a digital harmony, that he used code, etc., to be able to bring forward. But it's very similar to maybe the Lissajous figure. It is definitely like a harmonic process of an unfolding of these images over time. Finally then, what I would like to talk about a little bit is composition. the idea that you might compose, you structure your visuals and your music, and that moves into a slightly different realm, and that's probably what's beginning to happen now. Often what happens is there's so many ways of doing this. It's nearly boundless, a bit like maybe animation itself. You can approach this in so many different ways. So the structuring of the visual around the phenomena of the music is probably one characteristic. There's a deep listening involved. You don't just, do it without listening. There's also maybe a deep responding to the music, and the technology is a means to be able to try and bring that together. And sometimes you might not even need music at all to do the above. You can still compose visually with a musical perspective, but it's this idea that you might work with a compositional mindset, like a music composer, and even if you're not a music composer, but you have that idea that you'd like to deeply listen to music and let that be your basis. A very significant trend in the 21st century and at the end of the 20th century is electroacoustic and electronic music with visuals. And of course, there's a whole subgenres of different types of approaches, from performance to screenings to animation to all kinds of multimedia productions. But many composers actually now create their own visuals, as do visuals artists work with electroacoustic composers who work electronically with music. Often it's a composer might do both, and as I did in my own work, or sometimes you might do in a collaboration. Again, electroacoustic music is more like that fine art music. Electronic music is much more open genre as well, but it's the similar principles and methods of working. And therefore, some of the examples here, Brett Batty, Diego Garo, and etc., many of these have been shown at the Ponte Raya Festival because they're contemporary people that are working on these kind of works. And there's loads more. I just had to mention a few. But I just to honour maybe myself and the only work I've done in this, I'm going to show you a small snippet from a work I did with my daughter, who is an electronic musician, and she's also she composes now sometimes. We did this work called Dual Tones, and I was, of course, playing right the idea of tone, the fight between the tone and maybe noise and pitched music and not pitched music. We even had fights when we were doing this ourselves, as a mother and daughter would. I was playing on the idea of dual being two things, music and image. And also I got a sensation of a stretching. When Baven gave me a first piece of music, a feeling of two tones being stretched. So I was working my own phenomenal reaction, motion reaction, and I wanted to explore that stretching, as it were. So this is an electroacoustic music composition, and I made the visuals a lot with generative process in Isadora. I don't know if you've heard of that application. It's probably a bit like Max and MSP, but I also used After Effects as well. And I was interested in exploring the evocativeness of the music, so it was very much about that, and it was involved a lot of deep listening. I didn't want to end it just mid because it resolves. It's very important that the whole thing resolves. So I'm going to I have a few more examples. I'm going to skip and end my presentation now. And thank you so much for your attention. Special thanks to Ponte Raya, to Noel and Anna, and Sarah, and also to Miguel and all the Lisbon Animation Festival team. Thank you very much for having me. And thank you all for being here.